I thought my husband was just bad at standing up to his mother. I didn't realize he had been actively helping her build a case against me for over a year. And the worst part? The $7,000 invoice she slid across my own kitchen table, printed neatly on her personal letterhead, was only the beginning of what she had planned. I should start from the place where everything still made sense, or at least where I still believed it did. My name is Clara, and 18 months ago I was 31 years old, newly married, and so deeply in love with the idea of the life I was building that I refused to see the cracks forming beneath my feet. The apartment was mine. I want to be clear about that from the start because everything that came after hinged on that one fact. I had bought it 3 years before I ever met Jason, back when I was still working double shifts at the hospital administration office and eating rice and vegetables 4 nights a week to make the down payment work. It was a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a quiet building on Maple Court, with large windows that faced east and let in the morning light. In long golden bars that swept across the hardwood floors, I had refinished myself over one very long, very satisfying weekend. The walls were the pale sage green I had chosen after testing 17 paint samples. The kitchen had the cream-colored tiles I had installed by watching tutorial videos late at night after my shifts. Every corner of that apartment was mine in a way that went deeper than paperwork. I had earned it, planned it, and filled it with the particular quiet that comes from knowing you built something alone. Jason came into my life at a colleague's birthday dinner, somewhere between the second and third glass of red wine, when he leaned across the table and said something genuinely funny about the restaurant's pretentious menu. He was tall, easy laughing, the kind of man who remembered the names of waiters and held doors open without making a performance of it. We dated for 2 years before we married, and in those 2 years, I met his mother, Margaret, 4 times. She lived 3 hours away in Glenfield, visited rarely, and on each occasion she was perfectly pleasant. A small, precise woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back tightly, wearing cardigans in muted colors, carrying the particular brand of polite warmth that I associated with women of her generation who had learned to smile strategically. She brought wine the first time, flowers the second, and I thought nothing deeper about her than that she was a little stiff, a little formal but harmless. Jason would sometimes mention, offhandedly, that she could be a lot, that she had strong opinions, that she didn't always adjust well to change. I filed those comments away in the drawer of my mind, labeled minor inconveniences to manage carefully, and didn't open it again. We married in September, on a day that was cool and bright, with the maple trees just beginning to turn at the edges. We moved into my apartment. My apartment, both of us agreeing without much discussion that it made more practical sense, since I owned it outright and Jason's lease was up. He brought his bookshelves, his coffee maker, the leather armchair he refused to part with, and I made room for all of it willingly, because that is what you do when you love someone and want to make space for their life inside yours. I rearranged the second bedroom into a combined home office, moved some of my storage into the closet by the front door, and bought a new set of dishes that were a compromise between his preference for dark, solid colors and mine for lighter, warmer tones. We were happy, or I was happy, which I now understand is not quite the same thing as both people being happy, but I didn't understand that then. I made coffee every morning in the kitchen with the cream-colored tiles, watched the light move across my hardwood floors, and felt the particular deep satisfaction of a life that was exactly what I had worked for. Margaret called on a Tuesday in January, 7 months after the wedding. It was an ordinary Tuesday. I remember because I had just come in from a run and was standing at the kitchen counter in my coat, still cold, pouring water from the tap and listening to the radiator tick and groan the way it always did when the outside temperature dropped below freezing. Jason answered in the other room. I could hear the low murmur of his voice, but not the words, which was normal. He often spoke with her in the evenings, brief check-in calls that lasted 10 or 15 minutes and which I had never thought to listen to more carefully. He came into the kitchen afterward looking fine, perfectly ordinary, and asked what I wanted for dinner. I said pasta. We had pasta. Nothing about that Tuesday felt like a beginning. The first real shift I noticed came about 3 weeks later, in February. Margaret called to say that she was planning to come for a visit, not a weekend, as she had done before, but a full week. Jason mentioned it at breakfast, casually in the same tone he used to mention that he needed to pick up more coffee pods. I said, of course, assuming she would stay in a hotel as she had done on previous visits. He was quiet for a moment. That particular quiet I would come to know well, the one where he was choosing his words not for honesty but for damage control. And then said that she had mentioned staying with us, since the apartment had a second bedroom. I felt something small and instinctive tighten in my chest, but I pushed it down. She was his mother. It was 1 week. The second bedroom had a proper bed. I said fine. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon with 2 large suitcases and a smaller overnight bag, and within 20 minutes of her being inside my apartment, something changed in the air. It's difficult to explain precisely. It was less a specific incident than a shift in atmosphere, the way a room changes when someone opens a window in winter. You feel it before you can identify the source. She walked through the apartment slowly, the way people walk through spaces they are considering purchasing, touching the edge of the bookshelf, pausing at the window, asking questions that were framed as polite interest but had the texture of assessment. "How much did you pay for the renovation?" she asked in the kitchen, running one finger along the tile grout as though checking for imperfections. "Did you use a contractor for the floors? Or did you do them yourself?" She asked about the mortgage, about the building's monthly fees, about whether the neighborhood had changed much since I'd bought. I answered all of it, because they seemed like the questions a curious person asks, and because I was trying very hard to like her. But by the 3rd day, I had begun to feel the first faint edge of something I couldn't yet name. She rearranged the spice rack without asking. She suggested twice that the sage green walls were a little cold, perhaps a warmer shade would suit the space better. She asked Jason, within my earshot, whether he found the apartment a bit small for 2 people long term. He laughed and said it was fine. She pressed her lips together in the way of someone who has more to say and is choosing, strategically, not to say it yet. On the 4th night, I came home from a late shift to find the 2 of them at the kitchen table in conversation that stopped the moment I walked in. Jason looked up with a smile that was slightly too wide, the overcompensating brightness of someone who has been caught doing something they would rather not explain. Margaret looked at me with her steady, pale eyes and said, "Clara, wonderful timing. I was just telling Jason how lovely it's been to spend time in your little home." She emphasized the word little in a way that may have been unconscious or may not have been. I said I was tired and went to bed. She left on the Sunday, and I told myself that the discomfort I felt was my own overreaction, the introvert's entirely normal need to have her space back after a week of sharing it. Jason seemed relieved as well, lighter, more himself, and for a while, several weeks of early spring with the light returning and the windows going open for the first time, things felt easy again. I let myself believe I had imagined the electricity of that week, the careful quality of her questions, the way her eyes moved through my apartment like an inventory. I was wrong to let myself believe that, but I wasn't ready yet to be right. The second visit was announced in April. Not a week this time. 2 weeks, Margaret explained on the phone to Jason, because she was having some work done on her house in Glenfield and needed somewhere to stay. I was not consulted. Jason presented it as settled fact over dinner in the same tone, with the same careful casualness. I put my fork down slowly and asked why she couldn't stay in a hotel. He said hotels were expensive. I noted, with a precision I was proud of, that my apartment was not a hotel. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine and said, "It's just 2 weeks, Clara. She's my mom." And there it was, the sentence that would become the architecture of everything that followed, the load-bearing wall of every argument we would have and every concession I would make. She's my mom. As though that answered something. She came back in late April, and this time she brought a casserole dish, a bottle of wine, and a new energy that I couldn't quite categorize. She was more comfortable in my space, moving through it with the ease of someone who has already decided something. She started rearranging things, not dramatically, just small shifts. The coffee mugs moved to a different cabinet, a chair angled differently in the living room, the throw blanket I kept on the sofa folded and placed on a shelf. Each change was small enough to seem trivial, too small to complain about without sounding paranoid or petty. But the cumulative effect was the feeling of my own apartment becoming, incrementally, less mine. She used my expensive coffee without asking. She moved my running shoes from the entryway to the closet, which might have been considerate, except she didn't tell me, and I spent 10 confused minutes looking for them on a Tuesday morning when I was already running late. She commented on the groceries I bought, not critically exactly, but with a consistent, gentle tone of suggestion, as though she were a house guest who had been promoted, without my knowledge, to something else entirely. And then, in the second week of her stay, while Jason was at work and I was in the home office responding to emails, I heard her on the phone in the living room. She must have forgotten I was there, or assumed I had gone out because she was speaking in a lower voice but not quietly enough. The kind of not quiet that comes from not expecting anyone to hear rather than from any effort at privacy. I didn't catch the first part of the conversation. What I heard when I paused my typing and went very still was this. The name is on the deed, but that can be addressed. There are options. No, I've spoken with him, and he understands what's at stake. It's just a matter of the right timing. I sat very still for a long time after she finished the call. My hands were flat on the desk in front of me. The radiator was quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street below. I told myself I hadn't heard what I thought I'd heard. I told myself the name on the deed could refer to anything. To her house in Glenfield, perhaps. To some property matter of her own. I told myself spoken with him did not necessarily mean Jason. I sat there in my home office, in my apartment, in the space I had purchased alone and renovated alone and maintained with my own money and my own labor for 3 years before I ever met her son. And I told myself a great many things that I desperately needed to believe. And then I went back to answering my emails, and I said nothing to anyone. That was my first mistake. It would not be my last. The third visit, which arrived with no warning and no discussion, came in June. Not a visit, as it turned out. A relocation. Margaret appeared on a Wednesday afternoon with 4 suitcases and the calm, purposeful energy of someone executing a plan they had been perfecting for months. Jason opened the door for her. I was standing in the hallway in my work clothes, having just arrived home, and I watched my husband carry his mother's fourth suitcase through my door with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been rehearsing this moment. I asked him, quietly in the kitchen while Margaret settled in the second bedroom, how long she was staying. He shrugged. He looked at the counter. He said, "Let's just see how it goes." He did not meet my eyes. 3 weeks into her indefinite stay, on a Thursday morning when the July heat was already thick in the air and the apartment smelled of the coffee I hadn't finished and the lavender fabric softener Margaret had started using on her laundry in my washing machine, she appeared at the breakfast table with an envelope. She set it down in front of me with the care of someone placing something important. She folded her hands. She wore her pale blue cardigan. She was smiling. "Clara," she said, in the tone of a woman about to do someone a great favor, "I think it's time we had a conversation about the arrangements." I opened the envelope. Inside was a single printed page. At the top, in a neat formal font, "Invoice for accommodation and household services." Her name and address. Mine. A table of dates across 3 months, a column labeled "Accommodation Provided," a column labeled "Rate per Night," and at the bottom, in bold, $7,240 for sleeping in my apartment, for staying uninvited and without agreement in the home I owned. She had billed me for her own presence. I put the paper down on the table. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked up at Margaret, and she was still smiling, and her eyes were steady and unreadable, and I understood with a cold and absolute clarity that the woman across from me was not confused. She had planned this, planned it carefully over months, and the phone call I had half heard in April was part of it, and the questions about the deed were part of it, and "he understands what's at stake" had always meant Jason. My husband had known about this invoice. He had known it was coming. I said, very quietly, "Jason." He appeared in the doorway of the bedroom. He was already dressed. He had been waiting. He did not look at me when he came in. He sat down beside his mother and said, "Mom just wants to be compensated for what she's contributed." The word "contributed" landed in the air like something thrown hard. He had not invented it on the spot. He had practiced it. "Contributed," I repeated. "She moved into my apartment without my permission, used my utilities, ate my groceries, rearranged my belongings, and that is her contribution, and I owe her $7,000 for it." Jason finally looked at me. His expression was the expression of a man who is genuinely sorry, not for what he has done, but for the fact that you have found out about it. "Clara," he said, "can we just be calm about this?" Margaret tapped the invoice with one fingernail. "I've been providing household services," she said pleasantly. "Cooking, cleaning, laundry. My time has value, Clara. I'm sure you'd agree with that." Her smile was perfect. The arc of her lips precise and practiced, the warmth in it reaching exactly to the edges of her mouth and no further. Then Jason said, "The apartment has 2 bedrooms. You're not even using the second one for sleeping. It seems fair that Mom gets something for making use of the space." I went very still. The room went still with me. He had just argued in my own kitchen, on her behalf, against me, using my own square footage as evidence. I looked at him for a very long time. I saw it then. Not guilt, not confusion, but the steady, settled look of someone who has chosen a side and is waiting to see if you'll accept it. "When did you know?" I asked him. He was quiet for a long beat. Then he said, "We talked about it." 4 words. Not "I didn't know," not "I'm so sorry, we talked about it." My husband and his mother had sat together. perhaps at my table, perhaps while I was asleep in the next room, and discussed how to bill me for my own hospitality. They had talked about it. They had decided the rate per night. They had printed the page. I stood up from the table. I walked to the kitchen counter and set the invoice face down. I turned back and looked at both of them, at Margaret in her pale blue cardigan, at Jason with his expression of a man who thought this had been managed. And I said, "I'm going to need you both to give me a few hours." Margaret started to speak. I said, "No, not now." My voice was soft and absolute. She stopped. Something in my tone communicated that the version of me who apologized and accommodated and said fine had quietly left the room. Whatever was standing here now was not that. I went to the bedroom and I closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes and did not think about strategy or next steps. I sat with the weight of what I now knew. My husband had conspired with his mother to pressure me financially, using my own home as leverage, and had been planning it since at least April. The phone call I had half heard was not a beginning. It was a midpoint. I thought about the questions from the very first visit, careful and methodical, a woman building a file. I thought about Jason never once pushing back against a single one of them. I thought about, he understands what's at stake, and I understood now exactly what the stake was. This apartment. The apartment whose deed carried only one name, mine. The rage I felt was not hot. It was cold, precise, and very clear. Like glass, like winter air, like the morning after a storm when everything is sharp and still and you can see exactly how far the damage extends. Then I called my father. He is a retired civil engineer who reads case law for relaxation and whose idea of comfort is practical information. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Don't pay anything. Don't sign anything. I'll call David Marsh." David Marsh was my father's attorney, a dry, thorough man in his 60s who had once described himself as professionally allergic to nonsense. Then my father said, "Check your bank accounts, all of them, tonight." Something in his tone made the temperature in the room drop. I checked in my parked car outside the building that evening because I didn't want to do it where they might see my face. In my personal account, across the previous 6 weeks, I found 4 transfers I did not recognize. Small amounts, between $40 and $90, going to an account I had never seen. Not enough to trigger an alert, just enough to constitute a pattern. Someone had my login credentials. Someone had been moving my money, incrementally, into an account that was not mine. I sat in the parking structure and looked at the phone screen and felt the specific nausea of understanding that the violation was larger and older and more deliberate than you had allowed yourself to believe. I had written my password in a notebook in the home office. I had trusted my husband. My husband had clearly shared that notebook or acted on it himself. Either answer was a kind of catastrophe. I called David Marsh directly the next morning. I reported the unauthorized transactions to my bank that same afternoon with a complete paper trail. I gave David Marsh the invoice, the bank statements, and a written account of every visit, every rearrangement, every overheard phone call going back to April. He called me the following evening and said, "She has no legal claim of any kind. The invoice is unenforceable. The transfers are a separate matter and more serious. Your bank's fraud team will handle recovery. As for the living situation, you have every right to remove them. Do you want me to send a formal notice?" I said yes. The confrontation came on a Saturday afternoon. My father arrived at 11. Margaret was in the living room. Jason was in the kitchen. The look on his face when he saw my father walk through the door was the look of a man who realizes the game has changed and that he is no longer controlling the rules. I sat down at the table and placed 3 things in front of them: David Marsh's letter, the highlighted bank statement, and the original invoice. I let them look. Margaret's smile faded slowly, like a light on a dimmer. Jason went pale. I said very quietly, "I've reported the transactions to my bank and filed a fraud report. My attorney has confirmed that the invoice has no legal standing. You are both going to need to find somewhere else to stay, effective today. And Jason, what happens next depends entirely on what you decide in the next 5 minutes." The silence was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Margaret's hands made a small, restless adjustment on the table, the first uncontrolled movement I had ever seen from her. She looked at Jason. He did not look at her. He looked at me, and his expression had finally moved past the settled certainty of a man with a plan into something rawer and less prepared. Then Margaret leaned forward and said, in the smooth, warm register she had always used, "Clara, sweetheart, we're family. Surely we can work this out together, like adults." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about every little home, every rearranged spice rack, every careful question about the deed, every night she had slept in my apartment on a plan I had never been shown. I said, "You're right. Let's work it out like adults. Your belongings will be in the hallway by 5 o'clock. If you'd like to discuss the invoice further, you can direct all correspondence to David Marsh." I slid his card across the table. She looked at it. She did not pick it up. Margaret left that afternoon with her 4 suitcases and the particular dignity of a woman who refuses to be seen losing. She did not say goodbye to me. Jason stood at the door for a moment after she left, one hand on the frame, looking at the space where she had been. Then he turned around and I was standing in the kitchen, and the apartment felt like itself again. Mine. Quiet, the evening light moving across the floor I had refinished alone. We did not save the marriage. As the full picture became clear over the following weeks, that Jason had known about the invoice for 2 months, that he had helped draft the rate schedule, that the bank transfers were him establishing a pattern before a larger ask. I understood that the man I had believed in was a man I had substantially invented. He moved out in August. He took his bookshelves, his coffee maker, and his leather armchair. He left the compromise dishes. I put them in a box for the donation bin. The bank recovered the transferred funds. David Marsh's letter to Margaret was sufficient to close that chapter permanently. It is October now. The maple trees on Maple Court are turning at the edges, the same color they were the September I got married, and the morning light comes through my east-facing windows in the same long golden bars, falling across the floor I refinished with my own hands. In the kitchen, I tiled myself. In the apartment I bought alone and paid for alone, and have now, at last, entirely to myself. I drink my coffee and I feel the particular, specific quiet of a life that belongs completely to you. Not perfect, not without loss. I paid something for this lesson. Not $7,000, which I never paid, but something harder to name and longer to recover. The version of myself who believed that love was an exemption from vigilance, that trust was proof against calculation. That version was generous and warm and wrong in ways that cost me something real. What I have now is smaller in some ways and larger in others. It is the quiet of a space that is completely, undeniably mine. I earned it twice. The first time with double shifts and rice and vegetables and 17 paint samples. The second time was something I am still learning the name for, but which feels in the morning, when the light is right and the coffee is good, very much like peace.